Bruce Willis, the renowned Hollywood icon, the man who transformed his tragedies into financial successes and his solitude into inner strength. He rose from the broken streets of New Jersey, where he lived in a dilapidated house where the sound of trains mixed with disputes, to amass an empire worth over $250 million. He didn't come from a ruling family. With scars, grins of pride, fractured bones, and each setback that only served to fortify him, he erected it on his own. He was the one who shone the brightest, the legendary bartender, the layman who rethought heroism. His gift to the world was death. Plus, we figured out how to laugh while we bled. He endowed us with a sixth sense. We realized that love might reach even the most distant places. However, a man fought silently to keep from crumbling under the burden of his own humanity behind every explosion, line, and smile that made spectators cheer. His enormous wealth is the result of an empire he established with blood, sweat, and toil. His luxurious estate, situated on the sunny hills of Beverly Hills, spans over 1 acre and features an emerald pool, a private screening room, and glass walls that open up to the golden California skies. Summer lights up the lake at his Idaho getaway, where he owns a piece of land. The spot he said I could only breathe in before. Lines of high-end automobiles in his driveway sprawled out like an exhibit honoring the American ideal. A fleet of shimmering white Rolls-Royces, a rumbling Porsche 911, and a Cadillac Escalade that he used to zip around film shoots for miles and miles. Those Rolls used to bring in millions for him. But behind every bruised check was a sleepless night, and behind every contract was a sleepless night in a mansion. Money is not the plot of this novel. He had to pay a high price to get it, because there was a man, real or imagined, behind that mythology who shed blood for each shot and who trudged barefoot through the rubble of life. There were eerie pauses in the midst of the applause when he could make out his own faint glow under the lights. Only the weary eyes of a man who had given too much remained after fame had consumed his rest, breath, and laughter. He continued giving even after his body gave out, smiling through loss and pain, implored for a break. As the lights go down and his loved ones stand by his legacy, it's hard not to cry thinking about everything he went through. If Bruce Willis has inspired you with his bravery or made you feel less alone in your struggles, then you owe it to this remarkable guy to give him a heart-shaped like. It's unbelievable that the hero of a previous era lived in a home where he was unable to escape. His life's journey didn't start with fame, but with the reverberations of a leased room's shaky walls. Even the earth itself couldn't calm the trembling of that dwelling whenever a train rumbled by. Idar Oberstein, West Germany, was the site of Bruce Willis's birth on March 19, 1955. In the midst of the post-war town's ongoing reconstruction, a hushed stillness enveloped her birth. David, his father, was an American soldier whose silent fights plagued him. Marlene, his mother, was a young German woman who, in the face of rationing hope, attempted to construct a warm home. They were destitute, agitated, and perpetually on the brink of catastrophe. On certain evenings, the chill seeped in through the crevices in the walls and encircled his frail frame like an alternate form of hunger. A sound he would never forget, his mother's gentle sobbing as her spoon scraped an empty pot, resounded in the kitchen. As young as 2 years old, Bruce and his family emigrated from Germany to the United States in 1957 in search of a better life. Yet, there were no miraculous developments in New Jersey. Cold and claustrophobic, their Carnes Point home had peeling wallpaper and the subtle hum of nearby factories in the air. A specter that never lingered for very long was money. In the early years of Bruce's adolescence, the marriage had irretrievably broken down due to his father's heavy drinking and erratic sleeping patterns. Bruce remained composed on the day his father departed. As the red light vanished, he did nothing more than observe the taillights fading down the street. The subsequent hush was more pronounced than any farewell. Being the oldest of 4 brothers, Bruce took on the role of the reserved protector, the one who would attempt to find humor in the mayhem in an effort to divert his siblings' attention away from the terrifying noises. He would put his hands over his younger brother's ears and mumble, "It's okay," even though he didn't really believe it. Uttering the words gave him strength on the worst nights when the screaming downstairs became unbearable. The quiet he felt inside his own mouth, however, was unprotected by anyone. With each syllable he stumbled over. It was as if he were barefoot on shattered glass. He recalled a time when he felt as though his mouth was filled with cement. He once attempted to announce his name aloud in front of his class, but was unable. More than any lesson that day, the laughing that followed lingered in his mind. His peers referred to him as Buck. The term remained, like an invisible wound that would never heal. It was ceased making an effort to talk. He had barriers surrounding him that were higher than any platform he would ever stand on due to his fear of embarrassment. Revolt followed. Militant resistance to a world that had already predicted his defeat. He went to class absent-mindedly, picked fights, and swore at his instructors. At the age of 19, he accidentally crossed the street in the wrong direction. Awakening rather than a criminal act. The sort that makes you look at yourself in the mirror and question how much you've changed from your ideal self. Hidden beneath the fury was a young lad, yearning to demonstrate his worth beyond the mere remnants of a troubled upbringing. Even supper seemed like a miracle back then. The turning point came when I was 17 years old. With a quiver in his voice, he gingerly made his way to the high school auditorium stage, freaked out. And then the unexpected occurred. He stutter-freed the second the spotlight was on him. Smooth, vibrant, and unstoppable, the words that had deceived him before now flowed out. That stutter was my first enemy, he would later admit, years later. And acting was how I beat it. The applause didn't feel like noise for the first time. Freedom was the feeling. His life's narrative was rewritten in those brief moments illuminated. The speechless youngster had discovered his voice. He would eventually rise to the pinnacle of Hollywood, and the quiet that had plagued him became the engine that propelled him there. Subsequent performances went beyond mere acting. In doing so, he quietly rebelled against all that had dared to break him, ensuring his survival. His childhood scars remained with him forever. He became invincible with their help. Even though the New Jersey lad became a guy the world would deem unbeatable, the reality is more straightforward and relatable. He had been wounded first. With those fissures, the light seeped in. As a result, the young man who had to stutter to stay alive started talking for a living. Comfort is never the incubator for a dream. Forged in the chaos, the famine, and the never-ending struggle for existence, they are unstoppable. It was still war in Bruce Willis's world. New York was the new moniker for the conflict. He left New Jersey in 1973 when he was 18 years old, with just a carry-on, a meal that was half-eaten, and the recollection of a stage where he had felt noticed. Thesis studies in theater was his intended major at Montclair State University. However, the no amount of instruction could quell the rumbling of his tummy and the racing of his pulse. Waiting for things to happen in life was not an option. He would later explain that this is what led him to abandon his studies, hop on a bus to Manhattan, and enter a fantasy that had no interest in him. Fame was not what lay ahead. That was the chill. A chill that goes all the way to your bones, creeping under the floorboards and reminding you that you are still just a nobody. The first winter he spent in the pits of hell was brutal. A dying man's cough sounded like the radiator. The city seemed to be shedding its skin as the wallpaper peeled and the windows rattled in response to the howling wind. His breath mingled with the air as he slept in his coat, occasionally putting his hands against the wall for warmth. After his rent was due, he slept on friends' floors with a duffel bag that felt too light for all of his belongings. In his words, "I wasn't homeless. I was close enough to smell what it felt like." He went on to explain that food was a luxury. There were nights when all you could eat was some old bread and a cup of water from the faucet. Sometimes he would get 2 days' worth of food out of a can of beans. The famine was not lyrical. I could feel it. An aching, twisted dullness that kept him up more than his goal. Socks were stiff from the cold and his shoes were ripping at the seams. It was as if the snow was a form of punishment every time he ventured out into it. Standing watch in abandoned factories that reeked of oil and rust was just one of the jobs he would take. He chauffeured strangers across highways that shimmered beneath sodium in such a heavy hush that he could hear his own heartbeat as he hauled crates until his palms split open. Lights. But on most evenings, he worked as a bartender at establishments that reeked of sweat, loneliness, and smoking. Someone was laughing too loudly. Both the music and the tips were excessively harsh. Even when he bathed, the smell of beer, remained with him as if the city itself wouldn't release it. On certain mornings, he would rise before the sun came up and stand in a long line outside the casting call, with snow gnawing at his shoes as he held a headshot that no one would ever look at. The casting director would occasionally not even raise an eyebrow. He would return home with aching feet and a pocket full of coins that jingled cruelly. However, he became more inflexible with each rejection. "You learn to live with no," he would explain afterwards. "You wear it like armor." Once he was behind the bar, he transformed into Bruno, a more outspoken and courageous man. As he poured whiskey, Bruno cracked jokes, had the guts to play the harmonica till the patrons at the bar forgot about their sadness. Every night there was a new show, a silent one, but one brimming with perseverance. Practice, he claimed, was every night. I simply was unsure of the purpose. However, hiding behind that smile was the same boy who had stuttering issues when he was younger. But now his rhythm was based on stamina. All of those years were a test for him. They fashioned him. The frigid weather, the lack of food, the shame, and the sleepless hours spent worrying whether tomorrow will be better. A man was fashioned from a boy. He later claimed that those years were about more than merely survival. They dealt with the construction of armor. He would become impenetrable in the end, thanks to the armor he crafted in frigid rooms, on hungry stomachs in cheap pubs, and through innumerable rejections. Bruce Willis had to save himself before he could become the hero who saved the world. Applause was not the first sound. Silence was the first sound, the kind that arrives just before a tempest, when fate is holding its breath. In 1985, while over 3,000 performers had previously attempted and failed in a crowded Los Angeles casting room, Bruce Willis's storm broke. He lacked sleep, looked disheveled, and wore a smile that unsettled the producers. However, the atmosphere changed the second he spoke. They weren't just heard by the room. The sound ceased. David Addison wasn't cast for the role. All he had to do was find it. On that fateful day, the world's bartender from New York finally placed an order with fate herself, and everything changed. There had never been anyone quite like him on television before moonlighting. He was the rebel who stared directly into the camera and made the audience feel as though he was speaking directly to them. He was quick on his feet, hilarious, and dangerously alive. Disdain, pique, rebellion. Captured on film, there was lightning. Bruce Willis went from homeless to beloved in the span of a few months, and he went from selling beer to winning a Golden Globe and an Emmy. The flames of fame, however, are fierce. On set, laughing disguised fatigue. Both he and the spotlight that shone on him were dazzled by it. He finally got what he had been waiting for all his life, he once declared. "I was quite overwhelmed when it arrived." After that, in 1988, the bartender achieved legendary status. He was given a script by Hollywood called Die Hard, an extremely dangerous assignment that most performers declined. The studio has doubts about him. The notion of a sitcom celebrity rescuing hostages was ridiculed by the press. People believed he was weak in the muscles but had great charisma. Unfazed, Bruce continued. He played the part of John Mulan with ease, and he fought as if it were genuine, despite the intense lighting and seemingly interminable takes on set. He lost a lot of blood, he staggered, he yelled in such genuine agony that the cameras didn't even need to pick up on his pain. Nobody could call John Mulan a superhero. Even though he was bleeding and crawling, he managed to survive. Die Hard didn't merely smash when it premiered in theaters' records. Modern action heroes were reimagined in this film. 4 sequels and a cultural icon were born from the picture, which made over $140 million. Instantly, Bruce Willis became an overnight sensation, earning $5 million for each film, a sum that had never been seen in 1988. After working his way up from New Jersey coin counting, he was now negotiating contracts to purchase entire city blocks. But Hollywood, much like gravity, relentlessly retracts. Only the ascent became more arduous. The 1990s were a time of both triumph and tragedy. He reminded everyone of his charisma, and now she's the one talking about death. Although he invested $65 million on Hudson Hawk, his passion project, it only made $17 million. His former champions in the media now called him irresponsible. After that, Color of Night lost $30 million, and Bruce experienced the first tremors beneath his feet since the bars of Hell's Kitchen. The news reported that he had finished, yet he persisted. On the Hollywood Walk of Fame, he assured, "You're only as good as your last movie, so I made sure my next one mattered." In 1994, he received the invitation to direct Pulp Fiction from Quentin Tarantino. To portray the role of Butch, the washed-up boxer, a character similar to himself, bruised but unbroken, Bruce took a huge salary cut. That was a risky move. Not only that, but his career was revived when the film exploded over screens. It was vital to him. Another miracle was brought about 5 years later by The Sixth Sense. Being a ghost in plain sight, he kept to himself, appearing disturbed and restricted. The performance made $672 million globally and silenced all critics, a startling amount that appeared to be Hollywood's method of expressing regret. The grind persisted even after victory. Bruce toiled away tirelessly for 4 decades, completing over 100 films. The hours were long and the stress was constant. On certain occasions, he would pass out in his trailer in the middle of takes, his shirt drenched in perspiration, while silently telling himself, "Don't waste this." His bruises were invisible to the naked eye, those that result from having to play too many roles for too many people. "The sound of each applaud eventually dies down," he whispered. "However, the work itself remains." In the new millennium, his wealth had surpassed $250 million. He had enormous mansions in both Idaho and Beverly Hills, and his name was practically associated with box office success. However, it was all paid for. There was a scar on every dollar. The nights he contemplated giving up reverberated with each victory. Bruce Willis's ascent wasn't accidental. He persisted. He may not have been the strongest guy in Hollywood, but he certainly wouldn't have fallen. Perhaps that is the reason why his legacy lives on. Simply said, heroes have the power to rescue environment, but only the most exceptional individuals manage to stay alive via their own efforts. So often, life dictates its own ends, and it can be brutal. His own home was quietly collapsing, and the man who could foil terrorist plots, rescue hostages, and escape explosions on film couldn't prevent it. Even though Bruce Willis had faced every challenge that life had to offer, this one came without a director, a script, or a second chance. The initial fissure in his apparently impenetrable universe was not caused by a financially disastrous film. It arose out of affection. Exactly like the gradual fading of an uncontrollable light bulb, it starts bright and stays long. Their paths crossed in the 80s. In a world based on deception, 2 stars are on the rise. After his recent success as a moonlighting actor, Bruce Willis is still somewhat of a bartender at heart. On the other hand, there was Demi Moore, a radiant, captivating presence who could command attention with a single look. Their chemistry was instantaneous and indisputable. It was like 2 blazing inferno. In 1987, they were married in a coupling that seemed straight out of a movie. They proved that fame and family could coexist and that love could endure the merciless light of Hollywood, and the public looked up to them as the golden pair. Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, their 3 girls, brought a little bit of ideal anarchy into their home, along with music and joy. As a father, Bruce loved everything. Once he got home from months of intense filming, he would set aside his scripts and let his girls climb all over him, acting as if he were unbeatable on and off screen. According to what he once remarked, "When I'm just dad, that's when he feels most alive." Those years are immortalized in images of him holding small kids, his eyes innocent and vulnerable, like those of a man who had at last found peace. Regarding Hollywood, though, a harsh cadence. It felt like an eternity between his exhausting film shootings and Demi's own skyrocketing ascent. Divorced couples spent weeks and months apart. Silences grew longer as the laughter grew thinner. Love can endure fame. Gradually, it eats away at it, eventually causing even the strongest bonds to weaken. Speculation began in the late 1990s, with some coming from tabloids and others from more discreet sources, into their own hearts, pondering whether love could truly endure when two individuals were perpetually apart. Following a 13-year marriage, Bruce and Demi filed for a divorce in the year 2000. Everyone was taken aback. In spite of the spotlights and the pressures of international renown, the couple had managed to raise 3 kids, making them appear impenetrable. However, betrayal and hatred weren't behind the scenes. Nothing more than 2 souls that became estranged as they pursued goals that took them to opposite sides of the globe. The silence was heavier than any line I ever forgot on set. Bruce reflected of the day he and his daughter parted ways. He walked through rooms that still smelled like childhood, the faint echo of giggles, the ghosts of pancake breakfasts. He paused by his daughter's bedrooms, where the beds were made and the toys were frozen in mid-play, and felt the air press down like a weight he couldn't lift. Years later, the man who had rescued the world on screen so many times couldn't save himself from the emptiness of mourning. The hardest part, he whispered, wasn't losing a marriage, but the sound of their footsteps. The world saw Bruce and Demi's divorce as an ending, but to them it became something rarer, an evolution. In a town where distrust and animosity were rampant, they chose grace. Friends described their relationship after the divorce as strangely peaceful, built on mutual respect and an unspoken promise to always put their daughters first. However, for Bruce, the quiet after the lights went out was its own kind of war. They remained close, shared holidays, birthdays, and even Christmas mornings. It's proof that love can survive in a different form. "She's the mother of my children," Bruce once said. That doesn't end. Off-screen, he struggled with a loneliness that the camera couldn't capture. As a father, he couldn't be there for his daughters every morning and night because his work took him halfway across the world. They grew up with phone calls and weekend visits, but he never complained. He just worked harder. On rare occasions, he would be honest about the pain he felt. You always hope you're providing enough even when you're not. On weekends, he would return home and stare at their faces, thinking about all the things he had missed. A fresh haircut, a new laugh, a piece of his childhood that had slipped away. Fame had given him everything he had ever wanted, but it had also stolen time, the one currency he could never get back. His mind would wander between takes as he sat in his trailer, script in hand, staring blankly at the page, in a house where his daughters were likely already asleep. Following the divorce, rumors indicated that Demi received a significant portion of their shared estate, though they both chose to keep the details private out of respect for their families. Bruce kept his properties in Haley, Idaho, and Beverly Hills, which were worth millions. However, no amount of money could compensate for what he had lost. For a man who had built an empire, it was a devastating blow. Even with a fortune of over $250 million, he was unable to purchase presents. "I was rich," he reportedly stated. "But what I wanted most, money couldn't fix." So it was. Bruce Willis may have become a Hollywood superstar and created an empire out of nothing, but no one is immune to the consequences of being human. And that is the truth that hurts the most about his story. Not because it is tragic, but because it is. Years later, he reflected on this and realized that sometimes love doesn't end, it just changes its address. As a result, when his daughters became older, the laughter came back in bits and pieces, and the family could sit down to a meal again. He felt no resentment, but only thankfulness. He was grateful that love had endured in a world that destroys most things. "Being a father is my greatest role," Bruce Willis famously stated. It's hard to believe that the same man who once sprinted barefoot across shattered glass, laughed in the face of danger, and redefined what it meant to be unstoppable, is now fighting an enemy no stunt double can shield him from. The real ending may not be in the box office numbers or the red carpets, but in the man who, despite losing the home he had built, never stopped fighting for the people inside it. Bruce Willis had already lived the life most people only dream of by the late 2010s. He had been the smirking hero, the haunted soul, and the everyman who made courage look beautifully ordinary. But somewhere between scripts and spotlights, something began to shift. Even though the world had seen him bleed, sweat, fall, and rise again in over 100 films. Nothing, though, could prepare anyone, not even his most devoted fans, for the quiet, merciless war that lay ahead. Bruce, at 65 years of age, started playing parts in smaller, lower-budget productions around 2020. To onlookers, it appeared like a strange detour, a quiet decline. However, the motivation behind this decision was not weakness. Rather, it was slow, invisible, and unspoken. The signs were subtle at first, but he kept working and feeling alive despite his slipping mind. He would stumble over lines he had practiced 100 times and pause mid-scene, his eyes searching for words that wouldn't come. Directors, out of quiet compassion, started making adjustments, revising scenes, streamlining dialogue, and inserting an earpiece so that someone off-camera could feed him lines. To onlookers, it might have appeared carelessness. To those in the know, it was grief. According to his wife, Emma Willis, he simply became quieter, less talkative and engaged, as if he were fading away into an unrecognizable haze. By 2021, the rumblings had intensified, scripts had become shorter, and his scenes had diminished. As if out of love rather than sympathy, the crew worked delicately around him. He would still arrive grinning, that half-grin that had once lit up entire theaters. However, in between takes, he occasionally dozed off, his eyes glassy, lost in thoughts that no one could understand. It was as if he were observing a man grappling with shadows, still fierce, still fighting, but gradually losing ground. On March 20th, 2022, the curtain came down. His family, who had been his strongest advocates, broke the news. Bruce had been diagnosed with aphasia, a disorder that robs people of their ability to speak, understand, and connect their thoughts with language. The man whose words had resounded in theaters around the world, the yippee-key sound that had echoed through generations, could no longer even string together a simple sentence. It was as if Bruce Willis, in February 2023, the second devastating blow arrived. Doctors verified the disease had advanced. It wasn't aphasia. It was frontotemporal dementia, MFTTD, a degenerative illness that gradually erodes a person's identity by affecting their speech, movement, empathy, awareness, and, ultimately, their ability to remember their own name. The headlines described it as tragic, but Emma saw it as a fight for presence. In an emotional interview, she explained, "I was panicked. Hearing the diagnosis was like free-falling into darkness. She left the doctor's office with no cure, no plan, and nothing but fear. Despite this, she remained steadfast and became his advocate, voice, and shield. His brain is failing him," Emma whispered gently, "but he's still here." Bruce's doctors describe FTD as relentless, a gradual, unstoppable fading. However, his family has learned to see the light inside the darkness. Emma and Demi Moore were his rock as they raised 5 daughters, Rumor, Scout, Tula, Mabel, and Evelyn, and taught him new ways to communicate through touch, music, and memory. "When I see that smirk," Emma said, "for a second it's like he's back. Even though he occasionally forgets names, faces, and words, he still has flashes of his infectious laugh and the cheeky sparkle in his eye. He has stopped reading scripts. Those who love him guide him gently, and even when he doesn't recognize them, he walks strong and upright. The man who used to run amok in the face of explosions and fire now walks slowly, timed not by the roar of the crowd but by the beat of a more sedate universe. Gentle sunlight streaming in through the window, the comforting touch of a daughter's hand in his. Occasionally he hums, a weak, shaky tune from his days with Bruno. It's not in the ABC News interview. Diane Sawyer recalled a visit to him when there were no cameras around. Sitting on a peaceful patio, she said, Bruce reached out to take her hand without saying a word, smiled, and there was still that spark, she continued. It was Bruce. For a moment, it was Bruce. The only thing his loved ones have left to hold on to is a fleeting moment. Not a day, not an hour, of the man they miss so much. All it takes is a look, a laugh, a glimpse of familiarity to tell them that he is still alive, even though they can't see him. He remains a father. And by means of Emma, the unexpected journey is a guide for caregivers who are on the same path, turning suffering into purpose. Bruce has written it to raise awareness, which is more powerful than words alone. She has called these caregivers heroes, and her advocacy has motivated scientists all over the globe. She is now being hailed as an inspiration by prominent medical professionals. The unstoppable man, who was once a firebrand of rebellion, now speaks with more subtlety, but his message resounds with greater force than before. He has faced villains, explosions, fame, failure, and the passage of time. Now he faces the most human battle of all, the one in which love triumphs over sorrow. Perhaps heroism was never about the tricks or the one-liners. Perhaps it's about this, the way he continues to hold his daughter's hand, the way his wife continues to whisper, "He's here." Perhaps the most profound and lovely reality is that the one who rescued humanity is now showing it what love looks like in the absence of language. The true test of a hero isn't the volume of his voice, but rather the depth to which he is remembered when all else fails. And when the world stops talking, Bruce Willis will always be heard. His family, which includes his ex-wife Demi Moore and their 3 daughters, Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, are united in a way that fame alone cannot capture. Their love for one another. They call it the new kind of together. It's not the family dinners or the film premieres anymore. It's the everyday gestures, a shared song, a touch, the soft hum of a familiar melody that stirs something. His 2 youngest daughters, Mabel and Evelyn, provide a gentler rhythm to his world by walking him through the garden and showing him sunlight, birds or flowers as if reintroducing the world to him, one color at a time. And he smiles, sometimes faintly, sometimes fully, but always truly. Emma famously quipped, "We're in this together." So although FTD might take away understanding, it cannot take away connection. We managed to get through it that way. They accomplish this not with grandiose displays of emotion, but with the gentleness of being consistent, just turning up, hanging on, and being fully present. Occasionally, there are bursts of energy, little miracles that seem like the sun poking through a cloud. One of his daughters laughs, and he feels a spark in his eyes. On a walk, he gently squeezes Emma's hand. The moment is brief, but it's enough to remind them that love is still there, even though it has learned a new language. There's a video, simple, tender, and unforgettable. Bruce sits in the garden, enjoying the afternoon. A father's instinct, unaffected by time or illness, gently lifts his hand to his daughter's back as light streams across his face. His youngest daughter leans against him, her small hand resting on his chest. He remains silent, choosing not to speak. Rumor, his daughter, once said, "Even if he can't say my name, I know he remembers every second of loving me." It is an image that has stayed with millions because it says everything that words cannot. His most powerful role has been the quiet, unspoken courage. The measure of a hero isn't how many battles he wins on screen, but how gently he faces the battles no one else can fight for him. Bruce Willis may no longer be the voice that filled theaters, but he remains the heartbeat of those who love him. Those words still echo not just through their home, but through the hearts of everyone who ever admired him. Despite the explosions, gunfire, and one-liners that made him famous, it is this kind of courage that has become his most powerful role. At 70 years old, Bruce Willis has retired from the limelight of Hollywood, leading a life that is at once triumphant and tragic, the purest form of immortality, perhaps because it is not to be remembered in the din of fame, but in the quiet of love. For even in this latter state, he is unbreakable. The story of a man who rose from humble beginnings, a boy from the rough sidewalks of New Jersey who, once upon a time, couldn't afford a decent meal, who departed from home with only a suitcase and a half-eaten sandwich, and transformed that hunger into a fortune worth over $250 million. A figure that sounds abstract and almost mythical until you consider the decades it took, the bones it broke, and the sleep it stole to earn that fortune. And that fortune was not born from luck, but rather carved from grit. He amassed an empire with each film he was in, from Die Hard to The Sixth Sense. His $5 million salary for Die Hard in 1988 was unprecedented, making headlines and changing Hollywood's hero valuation. The sequels, which spanned decades, earned over $1.4 billion worldwide. By the end of his career, he had completed over 100 films, and he was one of the highest-paid actors of his generation. Much of his fortune was prudently turned into real legacies, houses that spoke of tranquility rather than authority. He had a $20 million mansion in Beverly Hills, set against sunny canyons with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the California sky. Away from the clamor of fame, in Idaho, he constructed a lakeside retreat, 20 acres of peace and quiet where snow-covered pine trees mirrored on placid waters. "It's the only place I can breathe," he once said. And when he did breathe there, in the stillness, it was as if the lad who had grown up in a bullpen had at last found peace. His holdings extend beyond those refugees, including apartments in Manhattan, a ranch in Montana, and a villa in Turks and Caicos, where turquoise waves lap against white stone terraces. Each house tells a story, not of ostentation, but of a man who had lived in turmoil for too long and purchased tranquility as his last luxury. His collection of cars, the one he rides in, a Cadillac Escalade that silently transported him from set to home after long, sleepless shoots, a Rolls-Royce that sparkles like moonlight, and a sleek and personal Porsche 911 all serve as artifacts of motion, reminders of a man who spent half his life fleeing from pain or running toward something. However, the most meaningful number may not be found in his earnings, but in his, for many years, Bruce quietly funded foundations in New Jersey and Los Angeles, never announcing them or branding them. He believed that generosity, like courage, should be felt, not seen. And yet now he cannot fully comprehend the empire he built with his hands and voice. The man who once commanded billions of dollars is no longer able to grasp it. In the embrace of his wife, the joy of his daughter, and the caress of the sun's rays upon his face, he finds solace. His golden voice, which once echoed through decades of film, now echoes in silence. His once impenetrable body has slowed down, and his mind, which once sliced through confusion, now vacillates between recollection and haze. The scene is at once breathtaking and excruciating, a life lived with the richest wealth and the deepest loss. The mansions, the cars, the trophies, they all shine and remain untouched. But the man who earned them now lives in a world where his worth is not measured by his possessions, but by his emotions. Perhaps that is the most authentic reflection of Bruce Willis's life. Not by the millions he made, but by the millions he moved. If you have ever been moved by his smile, held your breath as he saved the day, or found courage in his defiance, then please share your tribute below. It doesn't matter if it's in the form of a heartfelt message, a memory, or a financial contribution. What matters is that it encompasses endurance, grace, and the capacity to continue loving even when faced with adversity. Lost but never extinguished, Bruce Willis's legacy rages on. He may have established an empire that the world could see, but the love, bravery, and resilience he left behind are riches that no disease can take away.